You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your Security Plus certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Hardware vulnerabilities are weaknesses that exist within the physical components of computing systems. Unlike software flaws, which result from errors in coding or configuration, hardware vulnerabilities stem from design limitations, manufacturing errors, or physical tampering. These weaknesses are particularly serious because hardware forms the foundation upon which all software runs. Once compromised, they may bypass operating system and application-level defenses entirely. Examples include side-channel attacks against CPUs or flaws in chip architecture that leak sensitive information. Hardware vulnerabilities are difficult to patch or replace quickly, making them a long-term risk. Their persistence emphasizes why organizations must consider hardware security alongside software protections. Firmware vulnerabilities are another critical layer of concern. Firmware is code stored on hardware components, responsible for managing low-level functions such as device initialization and communication with the operating system. Examples include firmware on network interface cards, NICs, disk controllers, or system BIOS UEFI. Because firmware operates at such a fundamental level, vulnerabilities within it can grant attackers privileged access, often below the visibility of traditional security tools. Attackers exploit these flaws to establish persistence or launch stealthy attacks. Unlike typical software, firmware updates are less frequent, meaning vulnerabilities may remain exploitable for years if not addressed proactively. Exploitable firmware in critical devices like NICs, disk controllers, and BIOS UEFI poses particularly high risks. NIT firmware vulnerabilities can allow attackers to intercept or manipulate network traffic. Disk controller flaws may expose or corrupt data at rest. Compromised BIOS or UEFI firmware enables attackers to control system startup, bypassing security controls before the operating system loads. Because these components are essential to system functionality, attackers who compromise them gain unprecedented control. Detection is difficult since most endpoint tools operate above these layers. For defenders, securing firmware on such devices is as important as patching operating systems or applications. Microcode represents another element of low-level platform control. It is the layer of instructions embedded within CPUs that helps translate machine instructions into physical operations. When design flaws in processors are discovered, such as those revealed in side-channel vulnerabilities like Spectre or Meltdown, vendors release microcode updates to correct them. These updates are distinct from operating system patches as they address the processor's fundamental execution behavior. Applying microcode updates requires coordination between hardware vendors and system administrators. Failing to apply them leaves processors exposed to flaws that attackers can exploit to extract sensitive data, even from otherwise isolated environments. Supply chain insertion risks occur when hardware or firmware is tampered with before devices reach the end user. Attackers may insert malicious code, counterfeit components, or altered firmware during manufacturing or distribution. Because organizations typically trust vendor hardware upon arrival, compromised devices may enter production without scrutiny. Once deployed, these implants are extremely difficult to detect and remove. Supply chain risks demonstrate that attackers may not need to breach an organization directly. Instead, they compromise upstream providers to introduce weaknesses. Mitigating this requires vendor vetting, secure logistics, and verification processes to ensure delivered devices are authentic and uncompromised. One of the most dangerous aspects of firmware compromise is persistence. Unlike malware installed at the software level, which can be removed by wiping a disk or reinstalling an operating system, firmware-level attacks survive reinstallation and even some hardware resets. Attackers who control firmware can reinfect systems repeatedly, creating long-term footholds invisible to standard defenses. This persistence makes firmware attacks valuable to advanced adversaries who prioritize stealth and durability. For defenders, it highlights why firmware cannot be treated as a background concern. Persistent threats require persistent defenses, extending security attention to the firmware layer itself. Vendor-supplied firmware updates play a critical role in addressing these risks. Only hardware manufacturers can release fixes for low-level vulnerabilities in firmware and microcode. Secure delivery mechanisms, such as digitally signed updates, ensure authenticity and prevent tampering during distribution. Organizations must implement processes to track, test, and deploy these updates consistently, treating them as seriously as operating system patches. Unfortunately, many environments neglect firmware updates due to their infrequency or perceived complexity. This neglect creates long-lived vulnerabilities that attackers exploit. By maintaining disciplined firmware update practices, defenders close one of the most persistent and overlooked classes of security gaps. Visibility into firmware versions across device fleets is essential for effective management. Without knowing which versions are installed, organizations cannot determine which devices are vulnerable or in need of updates. Inventory systems must therefore extend beyond operating systems and applications to include firmware baselines. Large enterprises managing thousands of devices face particular challenges as differences in models and vendors multiply complexity. Still, visibility is indispensable, as blind spots in firmware tracking leave attackers free to target outdated components. Treating firmware as a tracked, monitored asset ensures no device falls behind unnoticed, strengthening the overall resilience of the fleet. Hardware root of trust concepts provide critical defenses at the platform level. A root of trust is a secure hardware component that verifies the integrity of the system during startup. Secure boot, for example, relies on root of trust mechanisms to ensure only signed, verified firmware and operating systems are loaded. If tampering is detected, the system halts or alerts administrators. By anchoring trust in immutable hardware, root of trust mechanisms create a foundation for verifying everything above them. This ensures that attackers cannot easily subvert the boot process or load malicious code at startup. Reinforcing the platform's integrity at its most fundamental layer, including firmware and vulnerability management programs, is a necessity, not an option. Too often, organizations treat firmware as static, assuming that once a device is deployed, it requires little attention. In reality, firmware flaws are discovered regularly, and failing to track and patch them leaves critical components exposed. Integrating firmware into vulnerability management ensures it is scanned, monitored, and updated alongside operating systems and applications. This holistic approach prevents attackers from exploiting gaps at the lowest levels of the technology stack. By acknowledging firmware as part of the broader lifecycle, defenders achieve more comprehensive protection. Tamper evidence and physical protections form another layer of defense for critical hardware. Physical tamper seals, intrusion detection sensors, and restricted access environments reduce the risk of attackers altering hardware after deployment. For devices deployed in untrusted environments such as ATMs or remote kiosks, tamper protection is vital. Without these safeguards, adversaries could insert hardware implants or modify firmware directly on the device. Physical protections remind us that cybersecurity is not solely about code. It also involves defending the tangible equipment on which systems run. By combining logical and physical safeguards, organizations make tampering more difficult and detectable. In conclusion, firmware and hardware vulnerabilities represent an often overlooked but highly impactful attack surface. Unlike software flaws, they sit at the foundation of computing systems, making their compromise both difficult to detect and extremely persistent. From NICs and disk controllers to BIOS and microcode, weaknesses in these layers can grant attackers long-term, stealthy control. Supply chain risks and poor update practices magnify the challenge. Defenders must integrate firmware into vulnerability management, maintain visibility across fleets, and enforce hardware root of trust protections. By treating hardware and firmware as first-class security priorities, Organizations close gaps that adversaries exploit at the deepest levels. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Secure boot and measured boot are foundational concepts for verifying platform integrity. Secure boot ensures that only trusted, signed code is allowed to load during the boot process. This prevents attackers from inserting malicious firmware or tampered operating systems at startup. Measured boot goes a step further, recording cryptographic measurements of each stage of the boot process. These measurements can then be compared against known good values, enabling detection of tampering even if it cannot be blocked outright. Together, secure boot and measured boot establish confidence that a device starts in a trustworthy state, anchoring system security in the earliest stages of operation. Firmware signing and verification practices protect the authenticity of updates. Vendors digitally sign firmware with cryptographic keys, allowing devices to verify that updates originate from a legitimate source. Without signature checks, attackers could distribute malicious firmware disguised as official updates. Verification ensures that firmware cannot be modified or injected during delivery. Organizations must enforce policies that allow only signed firmware to be applied, reducing exposure to counterfeit or tampered updates. This chain of trust is critical, as it prevents attackers from using the update process itself as an attack vector. Signed updates become the assurance of authenticity in device maintenance. Safe firmware rollout requires structured processes that account for both security and operational stability. Updates should be staged first in controlled environments where they can be tested for compatibility and performance impacts. Once validated, they can be deployed more broadly, ideally in phases to limit disruption. Rollback mechanisms are also critical, allowing systems to revert to a prior version if the update causes unexpected problems. Without testing and rollback, administrators may hesitate to apply updates, leaving devices vulnerable. A safe rollout process transforms firmware updates from a risky chore into a manageable, routine practice, ensuring devices remain secure and functional. Inventory and asset management extend to firmware, ensuring defenders know exactly which versions are running across their fleets. This visibility allows organizations to identify outdated devices quickly when new vulnerabilities are disclosed. Asset management platforms should track not just operating systems and applications but also firmware versions, building a comprehensive map of exposure. Without this visibility, attackers may exploit forgotten or unmonitored devices that remain on older versions. Tracking firmware like any other asset ensures no component is left unmanaged. It closes gaps that arise when firmware is treated as invisible or secondary, strengthening overall fleet security. Vendor communication practices are essential for timely disclosure and patching of firmware vulnerabilities. Manufacturers must provide clear, actionable advisories when flaws are discovered, including severity ratings and remediation steps. Organizations should establish trusted communication channels with vendors to receive these updates promptly. A lack of transparency or delayed disclosure leaves customers exposed, while attackers may already be exploiting the flaws. Vendors that communicate openly and quickly enable defenders to respond effectively. Building strong relationships with suppliers ensures organizations are never caught off guard by silent vulnerabilities, reinforcing the shared responsibility for maintaining platform integrity. Firmware integrity checks and runtime attestation provide additional confidence that devices remain uncompromised during operation. Integrity checks compare firmware images against known good baselines, alerting administrators if tampering is detected. Runtime attestation goes further, enabling devices to prove their integrity to external systems by providing cryptographic measurements. This allows organizations to verify trust remotely, particularly important for distributed or cloud-managed environments. These tools help detect compromises that may occur post-deployment, catching threats that evade preventative controls. By embedding attestation into the security lifecycle, defenders ensure trust is not assumed but continuously validated across all operational stages. Isolation strategies, can mitigate risks posed by vulnerable hardware components. For example, network interface cards, NICs, with known issues can be isolated from sensitive segments, or risky USB peripherals can be restricted to sandboxed environments. Isolation ensures that even if a component is compromised, its ability to affect the broader system is limited. Virtualization and containerization extend this idea, allowing workloads to be compartmentalized away from hardware-level flaws. These strategies recognize that not all vulnerabilities can be patched immediately. By restricting interaction and access, isolation reduces potential blast radius, buying defenders time while remediation is underway. Hardware security modules, HSMs, and trusted platform modules, TPMs, play vital roles in protecting cryptographic keys and platform measurements. HSMs are dedicated devices designed to safeguard encryption keys, preventing them from being extracted or tampered with. TPMs are embedded chips that store secure measurements, enabling secure boot and attestation. Together, these hardware components anchor trust in immutable foundations. They prevent attackers from stealing credentials or falsifying integrity data, even if higher layers are compromised. Leveraging HSMs and TPMs ensures critical trust elements remain beyond the reach of attackers, providing a secure foundation for the broader security architecture. Emergency response steps are necessary when compromised firmware is detected. Immediate actions may include isolating affected systems, disabling vulnerable components, and contacting vendors for remediation guidance. In severe cases, devices may require reimaging with trusted firmware or even hardware replacement. Because firmware compromises are persistent and stealthy, rapid response is crucial to containing damage. Organizations must have clear playbooks outlining who is responsible, what actions to take, and how to communicate with stakeholders. Treating firmware compromise as a potential crisis ensures preparedness, minimizing disruption, while restoring trust in affected platforms. Documentation and change control practices are vital when managing hardware and firmware updates. Every update must be logged, including version numbers, dates, and validation results. Change control ensures updates are approved, tested, and tracked, reducing the chance of accidental misconfiguration or unauthorized changes. Proper documentation also supports incident response, allowing investigators to verify what firmware was running at the time of compromise. Without disciplined record-keeping, organizations risk losing visibility into their firmware lifecycle. Strong change control practices create accountability and traceability, ensuring updates enhance rather than undermine security. Transparency in updates builds long-term confidence in the environment. Collaboration with vendors is critical for ensuring proof-of-fix and secure delivery of firmware updates. Organizations should request cryptographic assurances that vulnerabilities have been resolved and updates delivered are authentic. Vendors must provide detailed guidance, including any compensating controls needed while updates are deployed. By working closely with suppliers, organizations can confirm that patches truly close vulnerabilities, rather than introducing new risks. Vendor collaboration also fosters long-term trust, as customers rely on manufacturers to maintain secure hardware and firmware. This partnership is essential in managing risks that cannot be mitigated by organizations alone, especially in supply chain contexts. In summary, firmware and hardware protections are essential to maintaining long-term platform trust. Secure boot and signed updates ensure devices begin from a known good state. Integrity checks, asset tracking, and vendor collaboration provide visibility and accountability throughout the lifecycle. Isolation strategies and TPMs protect critical keys and measurements, while emergency response and change control processes address incidents and updates effectively. Hardware and firmware vulnerabilities may sit beneath the surface, but their impact is profound. By embedding protections across all stages, from boot to runtime to update, organizations anchor their security in the most fundamental layers of technology. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.